The cargo freighter, Dahan's Pride, shook violently as it plunged through the alien atmosphere. Red warning lights flashed across the cockpit while alarms screamed their urgent warnings. Kim Tae-ho gripped the control stick with white knuckles, his heart pounding as he fought against the ship's wild descent. "Come on, hold together," he muttered through gritted teeth, watching helplessly as sparks erupted from the damaged control panels around him. The ship's hull glowed cherry red from the friction of entry, leaving a bright streak across the pale, purple sky of Kepler 442c. Below him stretched an endless desert of crystalline formations that caught the light of the twin suns and threw it back in brilliant rainbow flashes. It would have been beautiful if Tae-ho wasn't about to crash into it. The freighter hit the ground with tremendous force, carving a deep furrow through the crystal sand, before finally coming to rest against a large formation of blue-green rock. The impact threw Tae-ho forward against his safety harness, and for a moment everything went black. When he opened his eyes, silence had replaced the chaos. Smoke drifted from the ruined control panels, and the acrid smell of burned electronics filled his nostrils. Tae-ho unbuckled himself carefully, checking for injuries. His shoulder ached and his head throbbed, but nothing seemed broken. He was alive, which was more than he had expected just minutes ago. He stumbled toward the emergency exit, kicking aside pieces of twisted metal and broken equipment. The door hissed open, and he stepped out onto the alien world for the first time. The air was thin but breathable, carrying strange scents of minerals and something that reminded him of ozone after a thunderstorm. The first thing Tae-ho noticed was how light he felt. When he took a step forward, he nearly fell over as his foot carried him much further than expected. His second step launched him almost a meter into the air, and he windmilled his arms to keep his balance as he came down. "Low gravity," he said aloud, his voice echoing strangely in the thin air. "Maybe 1/3 Earth normal." He experimented with walking, gradually learning to control his movements in the alien environment. Each step felt like he was bouncing on a trampoline, and when he tried a small jump, he soared nearly 2 meters high before floating gently back down. The twin suns were setting on the horizon, painting the crystal desert in shades of gold and crimson. Tae-ho was wondering how he would survive the night when he heard them coming. The sound was like wind chimes mixed with the soft tinkling of glass, growing louder as they approached. The Viridians appeared from behind a cluster of towering crystal spires, moving with fluid grace across the desert floor. Tae-ho's first thought was that they looked like living art sculptures. They were tall and impossibly thin, with long limbs that seemed too delicate to support even their light frames. Their skin had a faint translucent quality, and veins of soft light pulsed beneath the surface in slow hypnotic patterns. There were about 20 of them, led by an elderly female whose crystalline eyes reflected the dying sunlight like prisms. They moved in perfect silence until they were about 30 meters away, then stopped as one and stared at the strange creature that had fallen from the sky. Tae-ho raised his hand in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "Hello?" he called out, though he doubted they would understand. The Viridians whispered among themselves in voices like singing crystal. Their language was musical and completely alien to Tae-ho's ears. The elderly leader stepped forward, her head tilted in curiosity as she studied him. That was when Tae-ho made his first mistake. Trying to show he was friendly, he decided to demonstrate that he meant no harm by moving away from his crashed ship. He took what he thought was a casual hop backward. To the Viridians, it looked like he had just leaped 4 meters through the air without any effort at all. Every single Viridian dropped to their knees in perfect unison. Their musical voices rose in what could only be described as a hymn of worship, and their translucent skin began glowing brighter with excitement or fear. No, wait," Tae-ho said, waving his hands frantically. This is just the gravity. I'm normal where I come from." But his protest only seemed to make things worse. The elderly leader, whom he would later learn was called Elder Nimara, approached him with reverent steps. Her crystalline eyes were wide with wonder and something that looked like recognition. She spoke in her musical language, gesturing toward the sky and then toward Tae-ho. Other Viridians began bringing offerings from their packs, strange fruits that glowed with inner light, crystals that hummed with soft music, and delicate flowers that seemed to be made of spun glass. Desperate to show them he was just an ordinary person, Tejo walked over to a piece of debris from his ship that had been thrown clear in the crash. It was a section of hull plating, probably weighing about 200 kilograms back on Earth. Here it felt like it weighed maybe 60 kilograms. He bent down and picked it up with both hands, intending to show them it was just physics, not magic. The Viridians' hymn grew louder and more ecstatic. Several of them began weeping tears that sparkled like liquid diamonds in the fading light. Elder Nimara prostrated herself completely, pressing her face to the crystal sand while chanting words that sounded ancient and sacred. Tejo set down the metal plate carefully and backed away, his heart sinking as he realized what had just happened. These people thought he was some kind of god, and his every attempt to prove otherwise only made them believe it more strongly. The twin suns finally disappeared below the horizon, and the crystal desert began to glow with its own inner light. In that ethereal illumination, surrounded by worshipping aliens on a world far from home, Kim Tejo understood that his real troubles were just beginning. The morning after the crash, Tejo woke up in what the Viridians called their sacred guest chamber. It was a beautiful room carved from living crystal, with walls that glowed softly and seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a heartbeat. He had tried to refuse their hospitality, but Elder Nimara had insisted with such gentle firmness that he couldn't say no. When he stepped outside, he found dozens of Viridians waiting for him. They knelt as soon as they saw him, their voices rising in that strange musical language. Tejo felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment. All he wanted was to check his ship for salvageable communication equipment, but every step he took was watched and analyzed by his unwanted audience. The first incident happened when he was examining the wreckage of his freighter. A piece of the engine housing had fallen at an awkward angle, and Tejo needed to move it to reach the communications array underneath. Back on Earth, it would have been heavy work requiring proper equipment. Here, with the low gravity, he simply grabbed it with both hands and shifted it aside. The watching Viridians gasped in unison. Several fell face first onto the crystal sand, their bodies trembling with what looked like religious ecstasy. Tejo tried to explain that it was just physics, that the low gravity made everything easier, but they didn't seem to understand. Or maybe they understood perfectly and just chose to see it differently. By the third day, word had spread to neighboring settlements. Viridians arrived in groups throughout the day, traveling across the crystal desert just to catch a glimpse of the being who had fallen from the stars. They brought gifts of food, precious stones, and artwork. Children hid behind their parents' legs, peering at him with huge crystalline eyes full of wonder and fear. Everything changed when little Kileth fell into the crevice. The young Viridian had been playing with other children near the edge of the settlement, where the crystal formations created natural playground equipment. The children loved to climb and jump between the lower spires, their light bodies perfectly suited for such games. But Kileth had been showing off, trying to impress the other children by jumping to a crystal platform that was just a little too far away. Tejo heard the screaming from across the settlement. He ran toward the sound, his long, low-gravity strides carrying him faster than any Viridian could move. When he arrived, he found a crowd of adults gathered around a narrow crack in the crystal floor. The crevice was about 3 meters wide and descended into darkness. From far below came the frightened crying of a child. Elder Nimara was there, her usually calm face twisted with worry. "Kileth fell," she said in the broken English she had been learning from Tejo. "Very deep. We cannot reach." Tejo looked around at the gathered Viridians. They were all staring at the crack with hopeless expressions. Their delicate bodies and light bones were perfect for their gentle world, but they weren't built for rescue operations in tight spaces. The adult Viridians were too tall and fragile to fit into the narrow opening, and even if they could, they lacked the strength to climb back out while carrying a child. Without thinking, Tejo stepped to the edge of the crevice and looked down. He could see Kileth about 8 meters below, sitting on a narrow ledge and crying. The child appeared to be uninjured but terrified. "I'll get him," Tejo said simply. The Viridians around him began talking rapidly in their musical language, their voices high with panic. Elder Nimara grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "No," she said. "Too dangerous. You will die." Tae-ho looked at her kind face and smiled. "I'll be fine. Watch." He sat on the edge of the crevice and lowered himself down. The crystal walls were rough enough to provide handholds, and in the low gravity, climbing was almost effortless. He reached the bottom in less than a minute. Killith looked up at him, with tear-filled eyes, chittering in the Viridian language. Tae-ho couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear enough. The child was scared and wanted to go home. "It's okay," Tae-ho said softly, reaching out his hand. "I'm going to get you out of here." He scooped Killith up in his arms. The child weighed almost nothing in the low gravity, no more than a house cat would have on Earth. Then came the part that he knew would look impossible to the Viridians watching from above. Tae-ho bent his knees and jumped. On Earth, it would have been a ridiculous attempt. No human could jump 8 meters straight up while carrying another person. But here, with gravity at 1/3 strength, and his human muscles providing the same power they always had, physics worked in his favor. He soared up out of the crevice, like he was flying, landing gently on the crystal surface with Killith safe in his arms. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Every Viridian in sight dropped to their knees, and their voices rose in what could only be called a religious celebration. Some were weeping, others were singing, and several had their arms raised toward the sky as if praying to whatever gods they worshipped. Killith's parents rushed forward, tears streaming down their faces as they took their child from Tae-ho's arms. They knelt before him, speaking rapidly in their own language while touching their foreheads to the ground. Elder Nimara approached him slowly, her crystalline eyes blazing with an inner light that Tae-ho had never seen before. In her hands, she carried something wrapped in cloth made from spun crystal fibers. "Now I know for certain," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You are the promised one." She unwrapped the cloth to reveal a set of stone tablets covered in ancient hieroglyphs. The artwork was primitive but clear enough to understand. It showed tall figures descending from the stars, beings of incredible power who would come to help in times of great need. "The Skywalker," Nimara continued, pointing to one particular carving that showed a figure leaping between mountain peaks. "The prophecy says you will come when our world faces its darkest hour." Tae-ho stared at the ancient tablets, feeling a chill run down his spine despite the warm desert air. The timing was too perfect, too coincidental. "What darkest hour?" he asked quietly. Nimara's expression grew sad, and she gestured toward the sky where the first stars were beginning to appear in the gathering twilight. "The great regulator fails," she said. "The sky palace that brings rain and gentle weather grows weak. Soon it will die, and with it our world. She pointed to a bright star that moved slowly across the heavens. Not a star at all, but an artificial satellite. "When the great regulator stops, the storms will come. The heat will come. The cold will come. All life will end within 2 generations. Tae-ho felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. These people were facing extinction, and somehow they believed he was their salvation. "I'm not a god," he said desperately, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they sounded hollow. Elder Nimara smiled at him with infinite gentleness, the same expression his grandmother used to wear when he was being particularly stubborn. "As a child, the gods always say that," she replied. "It is their humility that proves their divinity." 2 weeks after Tae-ho's crash, another streak of fire crossed the purple sky of Kepler 442c. This time the burning ship came down in the mountains beyond the crystal desert, and it took 3 days for the Viridian search parties to bring back what they had found. Tae-ho was sitting with young Haran learning basic Viridian words when the procession arrived. Haran was a curious child who had appointed herself as his daily visitor, bringing him flowers made of living crystal and chattering away in her musical language. She was trying to teach him the word for friend when the commotion started. Thikyo, Viridians were carrying someone on a stretcher made from woven crystal fibers. As they came closer, Tae-ho felt his heart leap with hope and relief. The injured person was human, Lee Sung-min was unconscious but breathing when they brought him to the medical chamber. He had a broken arm and several cuts from his crash, but nothing that wouldn't heal. Tae-ho sat by his bedside for hours, speaking to him in Korean and waiting for him to wake up. When Sung-min finally opened his eyes, the first thing he said was, "Please tell me I'm not dead, and this isn't some weird afterlife." Tae-ho laughed so hard that tears ran down his cheeks. "You're not dead, but this place is pretty weird." It took several hours for Tae-ho to explain everything that had happened. Sung-min listened with growing amazement as Tae-ho described the Viridians' worship, the ancient prophecies, and the failing orbital platform that threatened their entire world. "So they think we're gods," Sung-min said finally, wincing as he tried to sit up. "That's going to be a problem." As if summoned by his words, Elder Nimara appeared in the doorway. She took one look at Sung-min and immediately fell to her knees, speaking rapidly in the Viridian language. "What's she saying?" Sung-min whispered. "She's thanking the sky spirits for sending you to help me," Tae-ho replied with a tired smile. "Congratulations. You're a god too now." Over the next few days, Sung-min experienced the same overwhelming worship that Tae-ho had faced. Every simple action was treated as miraculous. When he walked across the settlement without using crutches, despite his healing injuries, the Viridians saw divine resilience. When he casually lifted a water container that would have required 2 Viridians to carry, they saw supernatural strength. But Sung-min brought something that Tae-ho desperately needed: technical knowledge. While Tae-ho had been a cargo pilot, Sung-min was an engineer who specialized in orbital mechanics and satellite systems. When Elder Nim-Ara showed him the ancient technical manuals for the Great Regulator, his expression grew serious. "This is actually pretty sophisticated," he said, studying the diagrams by lamplight in Tae-ho's chamber. "It's not just a weather satellite. It's a complete atmospheric management system. Solar collectors, atmospheric processors, gravity wave generators for tidal control. Whoever built this knew what they were doing." "Can it be fixed?" Tae-ho asked. Sung-min was quiet for a long time, flipping through pages of technical specifications that had been translated into Viridian hieroglyphs over countless generations. "Maybe," he said finally. "The main problem seems to be in the primary power coupling. It's a relatively simple repair, but it requires someone to go up there and do it manually. The Viridians have built spacesuits, but look at this." He showed Tae-ho a diagram of the primitive space equipment. "These suits are designed for their physiology: light bones, low muscle mass, efficient oxygen use. A Viridian might survive in space for 30 minutes if they're lucky." Tae-ho studied the technical drawings. The spacesuits looked like works of art, beautiful and delicate, but clearly not built for the harsh environment of space. "How long would the repair take?" "Maybe 6 hours if everything goes perfectly. 12 hours if we run into complications." Sung-min met his eyes. "For them, it's a death sentence. For us, it's just extremely dangerous." The weight of that realization settled over both men like a heavy blanket. They sat in silence, listening to the soft musical sounds of the Viridian settlement going about its evening routine. The next morning, Haran arrived with her usual gift of crystal flowers. But this time she brought something else: a drawing she had made on a piece of smooth stone. It showed stick figures of Viridians playing under a bright sun, with 2 taller figures watching over them protectively. The 2 tall figures had crude wings drawn on their backs. "Sky gods," she said proudly in her broken English, pointing to the winged figures. Then she pointed to Tae-ho and Sung-min. "You." Tae-ho felt something twist in his chest as he looked at the child's innocent drawing. Haran was maybe 7 years old in human terms, with her whole life ahead of her. If they did nothing, she would live to see her world die. That evening, he and Sung-min walked to the edge of the settlement where they could see the Great Regulator moving slowly across the star-filled sky. It looked like just another point of light. But Tae-ho knew that tiny dot held the fate of an entire civilization. "My girlfriend Jiwon is going to kill me if she ever finds out about this," Tae-ho said quietly. "My mother always told me I was too reckless for my own good," Sung-min replied. "I guess she was right." They watched the satellite continue its ancient orbit, a machine built by a long-dead civilization to care for the descendants they would never meet. The Viridians had maintained it for thousands of years, but their delicate biology had never been designed for the harsh work of space repair. "If we try and fail, we die," Sungmin said, voicing what they were both thinking. Taeho thought about Harin's drawing, about Elder Nimara's kind eyes, about all the Viridians who looked at him with such desperate hope. If we don't try, they all die. The alien sunset painted the crystal desert in shades of gold and crimson, beautiful and fragile like everything else on this gentle world. Somewhere back on Earth, people were going about their normal lives, completely unaware that two ordinary men were about to make a decision that would determine the fate of an entire species. "Then we don't fail," Taeho decided, and Sungmin nodded grimly in agreement. Above them, the great regulator continued its slow dance among the stars, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to try to save it. The launch tower stood, like a crystal spear against the dawn sky, built by Viridian engineers working around the clock for 3 weeks. It was beautiful in the way that all Viridian construction was beautiful, but Taeho couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to ride a piece of art into space. "Are you sure this thing will work?" Sungmin asked, running his hand along the rocket's smooth surface. The entire vehicle was made from the same living crystal that the Viridians used for everything else, but reinforced with metal, salvaged from their crashed ships. Elder Nimara stood nearby, her crystalline eyes reflecting the morning light. "Our ancestors built the great regulator," she said quietly. "We remember how to reach the sky. The spacesuits were the strangest part of the whole operation. The Viridians had taken their own environmental suits and modified them with human technology. The result looked like something from a fever dream, crystal and metal mixed together, with life support systems cobbled together from 3 different technologies. The air supply should last 8 hours, Sungmin said, checking his suit systems one more time. That's if everything works perfectly. Taeho sealed his helmet and felt the familiar hiss of pressurization. Through the crystal faceplate, he could see hundreds of Viridians gathered around the launch pad. They had been singing since before dawn, their voices rising and falling in complex harmonies that seemed to make the very air shimmer. Young Harin stood in the front row, holding her latest drawing. This one showed 2 figures flying among the stars with lines of light streaming from their hands toward a great wheel in the sky. She had been crying when she gave it to him, though she tried to hide it behind her brave smile. "Ready?" Sungmin asked over the comm system. "As ready as I'll ever be," Taeho replied. The rocket lifted off with surprising smoothness. Taeho had expected the violent shaking and noise of human rockets, but the Viridian technology was different. The crystal structure seemed to absorb vibrations, making the ascent feel almost gentle. Through the small porthole, he watched the crystal desert fall away below them, becoming a glittering carpet of color. The transition to space was marked by the sudden silence. One moment they were surrounded by the whisper of thin atmosphere, and the next they were floating in the absolute quiet of vacuum. Taeho felt his stomach flip as weightlessness took hold. "There," Sungmin said, pointing through the porthole. The great regulator hung in space like a mechanical flower, its solar panel petals spread wide to catch the light of the twin suns. It was enormous, easily the size of a small city, but it looked ancient and tired. Several of the solar panels were dark, and the central hub was scarred with the marks of countless tiny meteor impacts. Docking with the platform was terrifying. The Viridian shuttle had never been designed for such delicate work, and Taeho found himself holding his breath as Sungmin guided them toward the docking port. The magnetic clamps engaged with a metallic clunk that they felt through the hull. "We're in," Sungmin announced. "Now comes the fun part." The airlock cycled and they stepped into the great regulator for the first time. Emergency lighting cast long shadows down corridors that stretched away into darkness. The air was thin but breathable, maintained by backup systems that had been running for who knew how long. "This way," Sungmin said, consulting the technical diagrams they had memorized. The primary power coupling should be in the central hub. They moved through the ancient station with the awkward bouncing gait that humans use in zero gravity. The Viridian tools they carried were designed for beings with half their strength, but in weightlessness that didn't matter as much. The central hub was a cathedral of machinery, with massive power conduits running like arteries through the walls. At the center stood the primary power coupling, a device the size of a small building that managed the flow of energy from the solar collectors to the atmospheric processors. "There's the problem," Sungmin said, pointing to a section where crystal insulators had cracked and darkened. "The coupling is running at maybe 30% efficiency. No wonder the weather systems are failing." The repair work was slow and methodical. Each damaged component had to be carefully removed and replaced, with spare parts they had brought from the surface. The Viridian tools were delicate and precise, but using them with human hands was like trying to perform surgery with chopsticks. 4 hours into the work, Taeho's air supply alarm began beeping. "We're cutting it close," he said. "Almost done," Sungmin replied, his voice tight with concentration. "Just need to reconnect these last 2 power feeds." When Sungmin made the final connection, the effect was immediate and dramatic. Light flooded the central hub as the power coupling came back to full operation. Throughout the station, systems that had been dormant for decades hummed back to life. "Look," Taeho said, pointing through a viewport. The solar collectors were moving, turning slowly to track the twin suns with mechanical precision. The atmospheric processors were spinning up, their massive fans beginning to churn, and most amazing of all, the aurora patterns around the planet were changing, shifting from the weak, flickering lights they had been to brilliant curtains of color that danced across the atmosphere. "We did it," Sungmin said, his voice filled with wonder. The journey back to the surface was a blur of adrenaline and exhaustion. By the time they landed, both men were running on fumes, their air supplies nearly depleted. But as they stepped out of the shuttle, the first drops of rain in decades began to fall on the crystal desert. The Viridians went wild with joy. They danced in the rain, their crystalline skin glowing brighter than Taeho had ever seen it. Children ran laughing through puddles that formed in the crystal formations, while adults stood with their faces turned toward the sky, letting the precious water wash over them. Elder Nimara approached them with tears streaming down her face. "The sky weeps with happiness," she said. "The great regulator lives again." Above them, the ancient weather control systems resumed their eternal dance, bringing life back to a world that had almost lost hope. The rescue ship appeared as a bright star growing larger in the morning sky. Taeho stood on the observation platform of the Viridian settlement, watching the human vessel approach with mixed feelings. 3 months had passed since he and Sungmin had repaired the great regulator, and in that time the world had transformed. Where once there had been endless crystal desert, now green plants pushed up through the sand. Rivers flowed where there had been only dry channels for generations. The air itself felt different, thicker, more alive, carrying the sense of growing things and the promise of rain. "The skyship comes," Haran said beside him, her voice tinged with sadness. She was no longer the small child who had brought him crystal flowers every day. 3 months of good weather and proper nutrition had helped her grow, and she had spent countless hours learning English from both humans. Now she could speak it almost perfectly. "Yes," Taeho replied softly. "It's time for us to go home." Haran was quiet for a moment, watching the rescue ship's descent thrusters fire as it prepared to land. "Will you really come back?" she asked. Taeho looked down at her serious face. Over the months, he had watched her develop from a curious child into a promising young scientist. She had an incredible mind for understanding how things worked, and she had helped him and Sungmin with many of the technical projects they had undertaken to improve life in the settlement. "I promise," he said, "and you'll come visit Earth too. We already arranged it with your parents and Elder Nimara." The rescue ship Sol Station touched down in the cleared area that the Viridians had prepared. It was a sleek human vessel, all sharp angles and efficient design, looking completely out of place among the flowing crystal architecture of the settlement. Captain Park Min-ho was the first to emerge, followed by a small crew of technicians and medical personnel. Taeho had met the captain briefly years ago at a spaceport on Mars. He was a competent officer, but his expression as he looked around the alien settlement was one of barely concealed amazement. "Kim Taeho and Lee Sung-min, I presume," Captain Park said, approaching with his hand extended. "You two have caused quite a stir back home. Missing for 4 months, no word. Then suddenly your emergency beacon activates with a message about diplomatic first contact." "It's been an interesting few months," Taeho replied, shaking the captain's hand. By evening, the entire Viridian population had gathered for what they called the farewell ceremony. Thousands of them filled the crystal amphitheater that had been built at the center of the settlement. Their bodies glowed with soft bioluminescence in the twilight, creating a sea of gentle light that pulsed in rhythm with their breathing. Elder Nimura stood at the center of the gathering, her ancient voice carrying clearly through the translation device that Sung-min had built for her. "Skywalkers," she began. "You came to us when our world was dying. You saved us when we had lost all hope. Tonight we say farewell but not goodbye. The bonds between our peoples will last forever." Captain Park leaned over to Taeho. "Skywalkers," he whispered. "Long story," Taeho murmured back. When it was time for the humans to speak, Taeho stood before the gathered crowd. He had thought about this moment for weeks, trying to find the right words to explain what had happened between them. "We need to tell you the truth," he said, his voice carrying through Nimura's translation device. "We were never gods. We're just humans who happen to be stronger in your world than our own. The low gravity here made us seem more powerful than we really are. We're not divine beings. We're not immortal. We're just ordinary people who tried to help when help was needed." A murmur went through the crowd, but it wasn't the shocked reaction that Taeho had expected. Many of the Viridians were actually smiling, and some were laughing softly among themselves. Elder Nimara stepped forward, her crystalline eyes twinkling with what looked like amusement. "Young Skywalker," she said, "do you think we are fools?" Taeho blinked in surprise. What? "We have always known you were mortal beings," Nimara continued. "We watched you eat our food, saw you grow tired, heard you complain when the work was difficult. We knew you could be hurt, that you needed rest, that you worried about those you left behind on your homeworld." The elder's voice grew gentle. "But gods are not defined by their immortality, Skywalker. They are not defined by supernatural powers or magic abilities. Gods are defined by their willingness to sacrifice, for others, by their choice to help when help is needed most." She gestured toward the green plants growing in the crystal sand, toward the children playing in puddles of fresh rainwater, toward the clear skies where the great regulator continued its ancient work. "You could have stayed safe on the ground," she said. "You could have waited for rescue without risking your lives. But instead you chose to climb into our primitive rocket and risk death in the cold of space to save people you had known for only a few weeks. If that is not divine behavior, then what is?" Taeho felt tears running down his cheeks. Around him, the thousands of gathered Viridians began to sing, their voices rising in harmonies that seemed to make the very air shimmer with music. The next morning, as the rescue ship prepared for departure, Taeho signed the preliminary agreements that would establish formal diplomatic relations between Earth and the Viridian homeworld. Haran would be the first exchange student, traveling to Earth to study engineering and planetary sciences. In return, human scientists would come to study Viridian crystal technology and their unique approach to environmental harmony. As the Sol station lifted off, Taeho pressed his face to the porthole for one last look at the world that had changed his life. The crystal desert sparkled in the morning sun, but now it was dotted with patches of green where new life was taking hold. Rivers flowed between the settlements, and children played in gardens that had been impossible just months before. "Beautiful world," Captain Park commented, looking over his shoulder. "Yes," Taeho agreed. "And beautiful people." The stars beckoned as they always had, promising adventure and discovery among the infinite possibilities of space. But Taeho knew that part of him would always remain on this gentle world, where being human had been enough to seem godlike, and where he had learned that sometimes the most divine thing you can do is simply choose to help.